the Conservation Science Group at University of Cambridge. I have a background in sort of big food system modeling approaches. So my PhD was looking at bioenergy crops and afforestation in the context of also meeting global food demand. And now I think about the impacts of food on a broader scale. So greenhouse gases, biodiversity, all centered around global scale food system modeling. So yeah, so today I'm going to talk about the footprint of the UK's food supply, and if and how we can balance sustainable domestic production with overseas biodiversity impacts. So I'm going to shelve greenhouse gases for today, talking only about biodiversity. There we go. So a quick overview of the things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give a bit of background about agriculture in general and how it impacts biodiversity. And then I'll talk you through the modelling work that I've done to estimate the UK's impact specifically. And then I'll talk a bit about the policy landscape and what that might mean for future biodiversity impacts, and then an easy win for biodiversity. So agriculture is a threat to biodiversity. And not only that, but it's the threat to biodiversity. So agriculture is habitat loss, is by far the biggest threat to biodiversity. And obviously agriculture being the most spatially extensive activity that humans engage in, is the biggest threat to habitat loss. And to date, agriculture has been responsible for upwards of 80% of habitat destruction, natural habitat destruction globally. And on top of that, it's also responsible for about a third of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, which obviously drives further habitat loss and other ecosystem damage. So how much is the UK responsible for? How much damage is the UK responsible for? And what can we do to reduce it? So to model that, we first need to know what it is that we're eating. So on the right is a stacked bar of energy intake for UK consumption. So this is the 5-year average from the FAO stat database. So it's about 3,300 kilocalories in total, but actually about 17% of that goes to waste. So this figure includes wastage. So the actual intake is closer to 2,900 kilocalories. A remarkable amount of that is dairy calories, but you can see that about half of it's made up of vegetable products. So the bars, the bits in green, kind of a third-ish from animal products, and then the rest is sugar and stimulants. Spices, there is a tiny bar there at the top in between the two other blues, but you can't really see it because spices don't really have much of a calorific contribution to the diet. A very small amount of this is ruminant meat. So ruminant meat is beef and lamb, and it only contributes about 75 kilocalories per day, which isn't very much at all. But as you'll see in a minute, the impact of that is actually one of the biggest. And you might also notice that there's no fish on this diagram, which is something that we're working on. But the reason for it is that we haven't figured out a robust way to sort of consolidate biodiversity impacts in the marine and freshwater environment with terrestrial biodiversity impacts. But as I say, it's something we're working on. So we know what we eat, but we need to know where it comes from. So to do that, I used a simple trade model called a multi-regional input-output model, fed with trade matrices from the FAO, which is nice because then it aligns with the dietary consumption data. So where does it come from? Well, Defra claims that the UK is capable, well, is about 60% self-sufficient when it comes to food production. But in reality, most of our food products are imported in some proportion. We produce some things domestically, but sometimes we make up the demand with imports. However, it turns out that we are quite good at producing some things. So berries like strawberries and blueberries, grains like oats and wheat, brassicas, which is a great word. So that's broccoli, cauliflower, and roots like potatoes and sugar beet. We produce a large portion of that ourselves. So less than 10% of that is imported. We import about 30% of our ruminant meat, so that's beef and lamb, mostly from Ireland, New Zealand, and Australia. Other meat here, meaning essentially poultry and pork, we import about 30% of our poultry and 50% of our pork, mostly from Europe. And then fruit and veg, so that's things that we can't really grow here, like tomatoes, peppers, aubergines, oranges, bananas, avocados, all of that. We can grow them in greenhouses, but we don't really do it because it's not very resource efficient. So we import most of them from, well, all over the world, really, depending on the commodity. Obviously, bananas tend to come from sort of the tropics, but things like oranges will come from Southern Europe. Spices and stimulants, of course, are 100% imported. So stimulants, sorry, I should clarify, stimulants are tea, coffee, and cocoa. So, oops, sorry. So whilst 60% self-sufficiency sounds great, we can only really be self-sufficient if we eat those things at the top. And that's not to say that that's a bad thing. I think it's great that we're able to make use of global trade and enjoy all these lovely food products. But these products have impacts. So what are these impacts and how can we model them? So I'm going to introduce the biodiversity metric that, well, I've been part of developing. So the metric is called LIFE, and it's the land cover change impacts on future extinctions. And we've recently finished development, and there's a manuscript in preparation for submission to the Royal Society within a week or so, hopefully. And it's a novel metric, and it accounts for not only how many species are present in a location, but also how important that location is to the species. So places with high levels of endemism, that's places like Madagascar, where there are lots of species that only live in Madagascar. Habitat change in that location will be more impactful than, for example, northern Siberia, where there are a few species, but they have huge ranges. And it also has a pre-human baseline, so it does account for places like the UK, where right now most of it's agriculture, but historically there was actually a lot of natural habitat. So it takes that into account as well. And importantly, the summed values of this metric are equivalent to the probable expected extinctions annually. So a value of 1 means you're causing an expected extinction per year of some species. And I should clarify that when I say species, going into this model are about 30,000 species from the IUCN Red List. So that's mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles. It doesn't account for plants, fungi, insects yet, which obviously is a huge part of the picture, and we're working on building that into the model. So I've applied this to my trade model to figure out what the impacts are at the point of production for our food supply. And this is what the metric looks like. Brighter green means higher values. You can see that Madagascar is actually really bright, and the UK is kind of almost invisible, apart from a splodge in the north of Scotland, and that's actually the Scottish crossbill, which is the only endemic vertebrate that we have in the UK. So that particular bit of habitat is really valuable to that species, which is why it comes out quite bright. But you can see that most of the areas of high impact are concentrated in the global south and in the tropics. And importantly, actually, for UK consumption, Australia has fairly bright patches of green, and New Zealand has a few as well. So what's the result? On the left, which is less important, are the estimated annual extinctions caused by the consumption of 1 kilogram of these food groups in the UK. And as you can see, spices is right up there. But that's driven almost entirely by Madagascan vanilla. So if you take one thing away, it's maybe by synthetic vanilla instead of natural vanilla. But obviously we don't really consume that in any meaningful, well, in any great quantity compared to other products. So the actual, on the right, you have the cumulative effect of UK consumption and spices gets reduced to much lower because we don't consume that much of it. So the stimulants bar is made up, on the right I'm talking about now. So the stimulants bar is made up pretty much entirely of coffee with a bit of cocoa, about 20% cocoa, which is a shame for anyone that likes coffee, myself included. The fruit bar comes out quite big, and unsurprisingly, that's largely due to banana consumption, and about 20% grapes, which is quite surprising because grapes aren't consumed in huge quantities, but this does also include wine, so that could be why that's quite a large number. As you can see, roots and vegetables and grains come out super low, so the things that we can produce in the UK or in kind of northern Europe tend to come out at a low impact. Unsurprisingly, berries have almost no impact, so enjoy strawberries and blueberries as much as you like. Monogastric products, so that's chicken and pork, are defined almost entirely by their feed requirements because they don't typically use much land. And ruminant meat, as with greenhouse gases, ruminant meat comes out at by far the most damaging product that we consume in the UK, despite that we only consume about 75 kilocalories of it per day on average. And much of that bar is, the ruminant meat bar, sorry, is found in Australia and New Zealand, with the remainder coming from South America, essentially, either for soybean for feed or the small amount of beef that we do procure from there. So the salient points of the previous slide, about 90%, 92% of the UK's impact is overseas. So we're a massive net exporter of impacts, of extinctions. And also that's likely an underestimate because that doesn't take into account the dynamic nature of habitat loss that's going on currently to make new agricultural land in those places. So demand for increasing amounts of soy will be driving deforestation in Southern America, for example. And as I said, ruminants are a huge contributor to the total impact. But luxury commodities, so that's spices and tea and coffee and cocoa, aren't to be ignored. And surprisingly, well, perhaps not surprisingly, but bananas are sort of a ubiquitous fruit consumed in the UK, and people don't really seem to think twice about it, and yet actually it's one of the biggest impacts that we have. So to put these results into context of UK production and imports, the UK is currently covered in about 70% agriculture, but this number has been declining. So we're essentially producing less. And actually, there have been some recent shifts in land use policy toward practices like wildlife-friendly farming. So that's increasing the size of your field margins for pollinators, placing skylark plots in the middle of the field for skylarks and other birds. And additionally, upland farming in the UK is currently, well, upland farmers typically make a loss and it's subsidized, and those subsidies are on the way out. So we're likely to see a decrease in production on upland farms as well. So that's typically ruminant production. So what does that mean for production and imports? So we may have, so this may reduce production on arable land. So we might end up importing more arable crops. But critically, if upland farming disappears, we may end up importing more beef and lamb, likely from places like New Zealand and Australia, where the impacts to biodiversity are worse than they are here. So for the global picture, we should try and produce everything domestically where possible. But obviously, that sucks for people and nature in the UK. So what are the solutions? Well, there's one easy win, and that's to change diet. And I'm not going to win any popularity contests for this, but forego the constant demand assumption that we were using before. So to do this, I constructed 3 simple diets. So that on the left is the baseline, And then the no ruminant diet, I replaced beef and lamb calories like for like with chicken and pork calories. And then vegetarian and plant-based are the vegetarian and plant-based eat well plates. So you can see that switching from ruminant meat to chicken and pork reduces the impact by pretty much a third. And then there are only marginal gains when switching to vegetarian and plant-based diets. So that's kind of a win-win for people that enjoy, a win for people that enjoy dairy products. However, the greenhouse gas consequences of those products can't be ignored either. And chicken and pork typically have high levels of other emissions. So that's acidifying and eutrifying emissions and soil degradation and water pollution, as we're all too familiar with in the UK at the moment. So to summarize, the UK currently hugely exports its biodiversity impact. So 90% is overseas. And those of products that we produce that are also produced overseas, typically the production impact overseas is much bigger than it is in the UK. And where we find ourselves in a policy landscape in which imports are likely to be increasing in the near future. But there are wins, and one of which is diet. Another might be food waste, and another might be intensifying production on the agricultural land we do have in the UK. So that's everything. Thank you for listening. And yeah, if you have any questions, please.
Oh, thank you, Tom. That was exactly 20 minutes. That's quite amazing. Thank you. Tom, I let people ask questions because I always start first, but today I think I'll change slightly and let Yasmin, who raised very quickly her hand up and who would like to make a comment, I guess, or ask a question, and then Francisco. Yasmin, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. I think that was very interesting, really quite fascinating. I mean, I was fascinated with the whole presentation, but the pictures of the picture of the world that you put up in terms of what can we avoid? I think that's quite eye-opening. I wanted to ask two questions, as your time allows. One, I was wondering if you so in terms of the food that's grown in UK for consumption in UK, and I was wondering if you look at how much of that might actually being exported. I mean, I guess is the assumption that it's we consume everything here, or especially like in the meat category, but maybe some other categories as well, if that's a sizable percentage of these categories. And then the second question, very different, is I mean, I followed all your points and make a lot of sense. I was wondering about, I remember reading that there is the argument that, at low density, some of the beef production could actually enhance biodiversity. And so I was wondering if, what's your thoughts on that one, and how does it fit into, is this based on maybe high density meat production and so on and so forth? So thank you.
Well, thank you for your questions. So on your first point of exports, so my model basically produces a matrix of where in the world each country gets each bit of food from. So I have it for all the countries. So if you looked at other aspects of the model, you could see how much the UK is exporting. But it doesn't factor into these results. But I suppose it could do. We could say if we export less, then what happens to our available land, and does that mean that we can be more self-sufficient and reduce imports? So that's a good point, and thank you for that. I do think that we're not massively exporting on most food crops. I think the main things we export are berries and turkey, if I recall. But I'm not fully across those results, so sorry about that. But I think we're not a huge net exporter. And then, so regarding the beef. I mean, I think you said beef specifically, not lamb as well. So this model takes into account, in theory, all production systems. So it looks at the typical method of production or the land footprint of the ruminant meat in the country in which it's produced. So in the UK, beef is actually produced relatively intensively when you compare it to somewhere like Australia and New Zealand, where there's these huge, extensive grassland that should, in theory, if it was natural habitat, be this kind of open woodland habitat. And actually, in those places, you could graze the animals amongst the trees, but typically for access reasons, that's not done. I'm not sure about enhancing biodiversity. I presume that's in the sense that you can create these grassland habitats with very low density grazing, and that incentivizes kind of short scrub and vegetation, which is a habitat for some things. But I think that's such low density that it's very unproductive. I don't know if you're familiar with Isabella Tree's farm in the south in the UK somewhere, but they kind of show that this like very, very extensive grazing does increase biodiversity, but it's not a way to meet the needs of the global population in terms of ruminant meat, I don't think. As in, we couldn't do that everywhere and still have everyone eating the beef that they currently eat.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
Jasmine, are you?
I mean, I think
the
that's yeah. Thank you. I appreciate the answers. I don't know the whole full logic behind that. I guess I don't know how much of that is to do with the animals, maybe spreading the seeds and helping with the. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to speculate too much on it. That the process through which and what type of biodiversity, etc. I think that's a very good point. I mean, I do remember coming across to it in multiple places, but maybe it is something that needs to be looked at with that eye, in terms of how dense or how sparse and what's the economic impact and food security impact. So thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin. I mean, following Yasmin's comment, Tom, are you also looking at the land, the amount of land that is actually used to grow crops that are used for animal feed, which I know it's a huge piece of of land in the UK.
Sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't catch the first part of that.
The land that is actually used for animal feed.
Oh yeah, so that's in the model. I didn't explain it very well, but on the horizontal bars there was a hatched section, which was the amount of habitat occupied by feed production.
Okay, that's helpful. Francisca, you have your hand up.
Yes, I do. Thanks. I have a question about the different diets you compared. In one of these slides, it would be helpful to see it again, but if that's not possible, then I'm sure we can manage.
Bear with me.
Oh, thank you.
Let's see if I can, sorry, it's being a bit slow.
Oh, yes. So it was I think, that one, slide 11.
Yeah. Is it this one? Can you see that?
Yes. Hold on. I need to make it a bit bigger and then I can see it. So I was looking at the vegetarian diet versus the no ruminant diet, and I saw that in the vegetarian diet, the proportion coming from dairy seems to be smaller than in the the proportions. Vegetarians still eat dairy and eggs, and yet the proportions seem to be changing dramatically. So where does that come from?
So I should have probably explained this slightly better. I didn't do this. This is a very I guess rough and ready result just to demonstrate what I mean with the reduction in these products. But so the no ruminant diet is essentially the baseline diet with beef and lamb swapped per. I think I actually did per gram of protein with pig and poultry meat in the same ratio that they're currently consumed. So dairy and eggs stay the same. But then for the vegetarian diet, I took the recommendation from I think it's the Vegetarian Society Eat Well plate, and it says, you know, have this much dairy, this many eggs. So that's why it changes, which I now see is not the most transparent way of doing it. And thank you for pointing that out. Hopefully that makes sense.
I'm really sorry to catch you out.
No, not at all.
I think this graphic is super interesting, and your research is as well, especially if it's so far progressed in some ways.
Thank you.
My next point is actually not a question, it's an invitation. If I may briefly interrupt the questions. So
yeah, of course.
IBAS, the IPCC for biodiversity, is actually currently working on its thematic assessment of the interlinkages among biodiversity, water, food, and health, and which is expected to be published soon. And on Monday, 20th of November, its external review is opening. So it is inviting all experts to comment on the chapters they feel competent to comment on, and it will acknowledge all the external reviewers. So I think that your research here fits fantastically well with that topic, and we'd be delighted to have you there, and of course everyone else who's here as well. Francesca, if I send you the information on this, could you perhaps share it on Monday to make sure that people are aware of the opportunity?
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. Yes. And
that sounds great. Thank you for
so
letting me know about that.
Definitely with Tom. Yes. Thank you. Martin, Francisco, do you have any more questions or comments? Sorry, before.
No, I will be in touch with you and make sure that everyone
Yes.
receives that information, because I think it's a really good opportunity for a lot of people in our network, especially someone like Tom.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Martin.
Thanks, Tom, for a very interesting talk. Did I understand you correctly that your measure is the extinction of terrestrial vertebrates? It's terrestrial vertebrate extinctions.
Yeah.
I just had a couple of questions. The first is the pragmatic one of how difficult it is, or can one speculate on how terrestrial vertebrate extinction might relate. I appreciate that the homework needs to be done on all the rest, but can you speculate on whether it will be a simple or a complex relationship with extinctions amongst the wider taxonomic group? And the other thing I was just speculating, I'm an archaeologist myself, so archaeologists and quaternary scientists, they associate terrestrial vertebrate extinctions with the aspects of the last 2 million years, i.e. the quaternary epoch, that one of the things about the fluctuating climate is terrestrial vertebrates go extinct quite a lot. So I wondered whether there's been a baseline looking at baseline vertebrate extinction quaternary, and I mean, probably the answer is the scale is many orders of magnitude more, but I wonder whether that comparison between quaternary extinctions and basically extinctions in the agricultural epoch has been made or could be made.
Well, thank you for your questions. In response to your first one, so this is a very static model, and it thinks about literally changes in land cover, not necessarily land use. So we can use it for all sorts of things. So whether that's agriculture, but we can also look at if land use changes due to climate change, we can look at how many extinctions might occur simply due to habitat loss from that. Obviously, there are other pressures, and I think your question kind of gets at that point, in that it's obviously an incredibly complex and dynamic system. So currently, I haven't thought about whether it would. I mean, it almost certainly would impact. Well, it would impact other taxa, but I don't know how it would do so. But there is work underway to include specifically plants, but with a view to look at invertebrates as well in the model in the future. But that's a lot harder to do, basically, because they don't behave in the same way that vertebrates do in terms of their distribution and habitat preferences. And in answer to your second question, I'm not aware that anyone's done that, but that's a really interesting point. And I wonder how it how the two might compare in terms of, so like essentially prehistoric extinctions versus current extinctions is what you were saying, right? And
Yeah.
yeah, that's a really good point. I will look into that. Thank you.
I'll see if I can fish out anything useful on quaternion extinctions. I'll send it to you. I mean, but you know, I mean, if you Google quaternion extinctions, there's quite a lot of stuff on it. So
Yeah,
it
thank
might be
you.
quite an interesting comparison to make without too much extra work to do as a desktop exercise.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. That would be really helpful. I can put you in touch if you want. Anyone, any more questions or comments? No?
Oh, I think
I think there
yes.
is, yeah.
Yeah,
I think
Yasmin
has.
Yasmin? Oh,
Hi, sorry, I
Yes,
can't
yeah,
always
I'm
find where
Yasmin.
the hand raise is. Yeah, if I might ask, I might have missed this, maybe you addressed this already. When you were talking about the potential impact on UK, I mean, I'm going back to the map that you have showed, you know, what could be avoided potentially. And that's, you know, the effect seems pretty small in terms of restoring. And I was going to ask about that, you know, why is it, and I may have missed this in terms of, you know, maybe the definition of the extinction or, you know, which, you know, species or biodiversity in terms of plants you focus on. I may have missed that, you know, at the very beginning, but yeah, I was kind of like, you know, it's sort of why because this and what would be the, you know, conclusion of this, right? So we like to see that, you know, every bit of helps or every effort can have some impact, and this gives sort of a different message.
So do you mean why there is so little potential for gains in the UK? Is that what you mean? Yeah. Well, it comes down to the fact that we don't really have much biodiversity compared to some of these other places in the world. So as in pre-humans, we wouldn't have had as much as some of these other places, and that's largely because well, we don't have that many species, but in particular, we don't have many species that only live in the UK. And that's kind of how the metric is defined. But as I sort of tried to allude to, I really don't want to give the message that, you know, conservation efforts in the UK aren't worth it and we should just farm the entire country. It's more that we need to be very careful about incentivizing an increase in imported food.
Yeah, so I guess it's in relative terms, I completely understand. So in other parts of the world, you know, we have, I guess we're both lucky and unlucky, but we're still lucky to have some of these biodiverse, rich regions and areas that need, you know, priority protection, etc. But if you were to somehow, you know, your comparison reference group change, then, you know, kind of like focusing on, let's say, comparison of UK, Europe, across, you know, maybe North America, parts of North America, and then sort of, I guess some of it is maybe because when you compare the indicators that are very low and very high, I can see that, you know, it is going to look like the marginal benefits are significantly lower, and but I could also see, I mean, I don't know, what do you think? Would it be useful if you were to sort of then also zoom in, even in areas like highly industrialized nations, you know, where already a huge biodiversity loss happened, but even in those areas, you know, some efforts could lead to you know, marginal improvements. You know, I do remember, I mean, I once attended like a workshop actually by Wildlife Trust, and they were looking at the, you know, wildflowers, and like for the arable land, you know, when you leave the margins, you know, without getting plowed and, you know, planted, even those lead to, I mean, weeds grow, right? So,
Yeah.
but then again, you know, it's nothing compared to some of the kind of biodiversity, of course, we're going to see in, you know, Madagascar or many of these other areas. But things seem to come back compared to maybe the plant variety that used to be there maybe 40 years ago or something like that.
Yeah, well, so the great thing, well, this metric's great in many ways, and one of the ways that it's great is that the values are, for lack of a better word, fungible. So we sort of make the claim that, well, mathematically you can sort of prove it with this metric that a gain somewhere is equivalent to a loss somewhere else, with the caveat that restoring land to natural habitat takes a lot more time than destroying it, if you see what I mean. So you would need to sort of account for the fact that it takes a long time. I mean, in the UK, not as long as, for example, tropical rainforest, but you know, it takes many, many years for things to come back as if they were fully natural again. But one of the difficulties that I've come into with this work, I initially started doing a bit of work around the government agricultural payment schemes, and obviously things like skylark plots and increased margins do improve biodiversity, but the changes in habitat, but that's not sort of covered by this metric, as this metric thinks only about changes in habitat. And you know, you're not going to see a 10-meter field margin doesn't appear in the resolution that we're thinking about here. So this is kind of a very like broad scale approach that lacks the nuance to answer that question properly, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Francisca, you have a follow-up, I guess.
Yeah, yes, I do. So firstly, essentially, just to sum up and ensure that I've understood correctly, this boils down to the land sparing versus land sharing argument, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, and the map is essentially illustrating the debate that land sparing and land sharing might be appropriate in different regions of the world, as some conservationists have posed. Is that also correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Pretty much.
Mm-hmm. So I'm interested in looking more closely at this map. I'm frankly not surprised to see biodiversity hotspots lit up on here. That's to be expected. However, I'm a little more interested in the variations we're seeing across North America and within Europe as well. They're quite dramatic. So is that due to increased biodiversity in certain areas, or is that also due to the fact that agriculture has had worse impact in certain areas? Because those are two different things, of course.
So this map that you're seeing now is the benefit of restoring per hectare, so per area of agriculture. So it might be that in a pixel that you're seeing as green, there was only 100 meters squared of agriculture, but at the more aggregate resolution that we're looking at, that would still show up as potentially bright green if that 100 meters stood to benefit the species that were present there highly. Do you see what I mean? So essentially, this is the restoration value divided by the present amount of agriculture there. So you wouldn't necessarily see patterns of where there is lots of agriculture, in the sense that you know, for example, you know, Madagascar isn't covered in agriculture, but the value of restoring what agriculture is there is very high. But I think to answer your question about Europe and Northern America as well, a lot of that will be down to migratory birds. So migratory species are treated slightly differently in this metric, in that we assume that damage to either its breeding or non-breeding range has more of an impact than damage to a non-migratory species equivalent area. Because if you're a migratory species and you rely immensely on this small patch of land to get you from A to B or whatever, that could really mess up your migratory patterns if you're unable to use that land, if it's destroyed for some reason.
Okay, so just to illustrate that with a concrete example, if we're looking at Spain up there, we would consider something like Coto de Doñana National Park, which is an absolute hotspot for migratory birds, and it would show green in your metric because of the way it's calculated.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so. I'm not actually sure where that would be in Spain, and if you'd be able to see it at this resolution, but yeah, that's exactly the idea.
Okay, thank you very much. That's really helpful in understanding this.
No, thank you for your question.
Well, thank you, Francisca. That was really helpful. Tom, just sort of in a way of follow up. I was wondering, is there some sort of mapping of all the effects of not just agriculture as we're talking about here, but also in terms of climate change? Talk about, climate change is causing the disappearance of X species, or the decline of that. But what is missing, in my view, is that there is not an overall picture of what happens once these things have disappeared. What's the kind of the chain reaction? And I think also for people will be useful because they make a little bit more, it becomes a bit more concrete. It's like David Attenborough's programs, and this, I don't know, seabirds are now going to disappear because of climate change. Okay, so what? Some people might think, oh well, never mind. So I wonder if there could be also an illustration of the chain reaction and the impacts. Does this exist, or other studies?
If it does, I've not seen it. I think that's a good point. I think what I really like about this metric is that you can really visualize where damage. So in the paper that we're publishing, this is one of the maps that you will see. So this is restoring, but we also have one for if you destroy all the natural habitat, where is the greatest damage done, and that one's really interesting as well. I'm not aware of sort of an aggregate damage map. Yeah, I mean, if anyone is, that would be really interesting to hear about. But yeah, sorry, I don't actually know. But it'd be really great to see. I mean, not great, but interesting, I suppose.
Not great, but yes, helpful. Anyone else has more questions or comments? Because I have just a quick comment before we conclude. Tom, you mentioned waste as something towards the beginning. And I was listening actually to a lecture, and they were talking about waste almost being inevitable at production, because if farmers were asked to avoid that waste, then the solution would be to find new markets. Yeah. Is that, I mean, what's the solution then? Perhaps Yasmin can contribute, given that waste has been one of her topics. If Yasmin is still here, wants to contribute. I mean, is this the reality? Is there actually a solution to this?
So I mean, I think some level of farm waste, as you say, is inevitable. I mean, it is inevitable in the sense that you have to be flexible in terms of meeting demands for supermarkets and whatnot. But when I said waste, I should have been more specific. I meant post-production waste. So that's waste in the household and in retail and restaurants and that sort of thing. So that waste definitely is more avoidable, if that makes sense, because there's no value in that. And actually all you're doing with that waste is essentially artificially inflating the demand for the food commodities. How you do that, I don't know. And actually the impact wouldn't be too great, at least within this framework, because in the UK, I mean, ruminant meat's not a particularly wasted commodity just because it's so expensive, but things like chicken and pork are very wasted actually. So I mean, you would see some reduction there, but it's not as powerful as diet as a lever. Yeah, hopefully that makes sense. I don't know if Yasmin had anything to add as well, but
I think for me it's it's also maybe not for every single food category, but for some categories it's also a matter of substitution that is not as highly encouraged or expected currently. So I mean, I think part of the food waste also happens because of, fluctuations, unexpected fluctuations. I think there always supermarkets are trying to model and kind of get it right. And then that sort of has affects the kind of contracts and orders they place, from the farmers and whatnot. However, so, if somehow the price of in other words, it's sort of like if there was a way consumers got actually punished through a pricing system or otherwise, for wildly changing their consumption from week to week or whatnot, I think that might lead to more, or maybe through educational. So in other words, like maybe I'll give a quick example. I think there was at some point a big shortage of lettuce. Maybe it's a weather related problem a couple of years ago, and for from the supermarket's point of view, it's unthinkable not to address that. So I have heard and read about some of the the big farms actually flying lettuce
Wow.
from North American market or wherever they can find it, so that they can deliver it to the consumer. So I think these types of expectations and the sort of the obligation to meet the demand, otherwise it's sort of like this unbreachable contract, invisible contract with the consumers. I think that is also leading to both surpluses and evidently waste. So I think some of those can change over time. That yes, if something happens and we don't have lettuce, I don't know, we consume more bok choy. We make our salad. I'm just saying, or we switch to a completely potato salad, whatnot. Or we don't eat salad for a couple of weeks. So so I think those involve more sort of societal, and market and consumer type of changes, that, it is not unimaginable for sure, because I mean, the idea is that, we're not going to starve, right? So if you don't present certain types of food, people are just going to naturally switch and they'll eat something else. So as long as there is nutritious other types of substitutes available, technically, right, that should take care of it. But I think it's the expectations and ubiquitous availability of products, food products, and the expectations that come with it is making it really difficult. There's also maybe farmers' side to consider, because they also tend to overplan so that they can shield, they can when the weather unpredictability happens, they still have enough produce to sell and supply, and fulfill their contracts. That's a slightly different type of, so they would need some type of insurance to protect them. Then they would be like, no, we're only gonna plant only a small buffer additional, not a very giant one or a big one.
Oh, thank you, Özlem. But I was thinking of this statement that I read about, if we wanted to reduce waste at production level, then farmers will have to find new markets, and that sort of made me then think, particularly on what Tom was explaining. Given that we're discussing product, import, exports, etc., so why not reduce? I'm not sure I understand, and perhaps is not entirely correct. I don't know if you've heard about this point that that waste is connected with markets. Do you have anything to add, Tom, or explanation? Or
well, I think it is that not what Yasmin was just saying, in that the farmers currently they produce a certain amount because they might have a contract with the supermarket, and then that might fall through, or the supermarket might decide that they don't need as much, for example. I mean, Yasmin gave the example of weather, but I think also it can be on the demand side, that change in demand can cause them to essentially have to look elsewhere if if they can't, if they've got a field full of apples that they can't sell to the
Yeah.
supermarket, they're going to have to look somewhere else for it.
And therefore effectively the agreements and those type of arrangements are not flexible enough. That's the issue, right?
I
we
think
need
so,
to
yeah.
look at the trade.
Yeah,
that
I think so.
Underpins.
Yeah,
this.
I mean, the problem with food in general, like, it's just an inherent property of it, is that you can't pass it around forever. It sort of goes off after a while, doesn't it? So that is a consideration.
Yes, yeah, that's true. Anyone, any more questions or comments before we wrap up? No. Tom, how much do you work also with policymakers? Because I think this would be an amazing resource. I mean, obviously Francisca made the point of the e-book, but also on a national level, I imagine I can see that there could be a lot of evidence to inform them, even if then of course they can perfectly ignore it, but
Yeah. So I mean, currently not too much, but I think once this work goes out, then perhaps a bit more. That we've had interest in the metric, at least from people at Defra, and similar organizations like NGOs as well are also quite interested in it.
Okay, it would be really great to consolidate in a way our role in pushing for more change, right? I think academics to perhaps disrupt perhaps a bit more as much as we can, at least.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And Yasmin is going to be on our coffee break next week, so I hope that you can all join us as well. And yes, have a good weekend, and thank you so much, Tom. It was a great discussion.
Well, thank you for having me as well.
The recording will be on our website. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Brilliant.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.